A masked man hurled a knife at the royal guard, convinced he was about to make headlines. But in an instant, the guard sprang into action, and what followed left the entire crowd frozen in disbelief that this is how it all went down. But before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We post stories like this every day at the same time, so hit that subscribe button and make sure you never miss a moment. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Harrington took his position at the gates. At 28, he carried himself with the precision of a man who had learned that survival often depended on the smallest details. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, his bare skin perfectly positioned, and his bayonet caught the light like a beacon of unwavering duty. The tourists were already gathering, cameras ready, children pointing in wonder at the motionless figure who seemed more statue than man. But Harrington was very much alive, his senses heightened by years of training that had begun in the harsh mountains of Afghanistan and been refined in the disciplined halls of Wellington barracks. Every face in the crowd was catalogued, every movement assessed, every potential threat evaluated with the cold efficiency of a soldier who had seen too much of what humans could do to each other. The weight of his rifle, though ceremonial in appearance, was a comfort against his shoulder, reminder that he was both symbol and guardian, both display and deterrent. Colonel William Ashford approached through the morning crowd, his grandson Thomas's small hand clasped firmly in his weathered grip. At 62, Ashford moved with the careful precision of a man whose body bore the accumulated weight of 3 decades in Her Majesty's service. His chest displayed the quiet rainbow of medals that spoke of conflicts most civilians couldn't pronounce, places where diplomacy had failed and soldiers had been asked to succeed where politicians could not. Thomas, barely 7 years old, gazed up at the towering guard with the wide-eyed wonder that only children possessed, innocent of the deadly skills hidden beneath that ornate uniform. The crowd thickened as the day progressed, a river of humanity, flowing past the palace gates in endless fascination with the unchanging sentinel. Harrington's training allowed him to remain perfectly still while his mind catalogued every face, every gesture, every anomaly in the pattern of tourist behavior. Japanese families posed for photographs, American teenagers attempted to make him laugh, elderly couples whispered about the traditions they were witnessing. All of it was normal, expected, part of the daily theater that surrounded the monarchy. It was just after 11 when Harrington noticed a figure moving against the natural flow of the crowd. Dressed in black despite the warming day, a hood pulled low over features that seemed deliberately obscured. The man's gait was wrong, somehow, too purposeful for a casual tourist, too focused for someone simply enjoying the spectacle. His hands, visible briefly as he pushed through a cluster of German visitors, were clenched into fists, the knuckles white with tension. Harrington's breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, but every nerve in his body had shifted to high alert. This was the moment his instructors had drilled into him during countless hours of training, the recognition that something was wrong, the split second when preparation met reality. His peripheral vision tracked the figure while his direct gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, the perfect embodiment of ceremonial duty masking the deadly calculation occurring behind his eyes. Colonel Ashford noticed it too. 40 years of military service had given him an instinct for danger that civilian life had never quite dulled. He felt Thomas's hand in his and made a decision that would probably save both their lives. "Thomas," he murmured, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Stay close to grandfather, very close." The masked figure continued his approach, weaving through the crowd with the fluid motion of someone who had done this before. Someone who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. His path would bring him within striking distance of the guard in less than 30 seconds. Harrington's mind automatically calculated angles, distances, potential civilian casualties. The training from Helmand Province, where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home and being shipped back in a box, kicked in with mechanical precision. The crowd around them continued their cheerful chatter, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. A mother adjusted her daughter's hat, a father pointed out architectural details. A group of students debated the historical significance of the changing of the guard. None of them saw what Ashford and Harrington had recognized, that death was walking toward them wearing a black mask and carrying murder in his heart. Harrington's grip on his rifle imperceptibly tightened. The weapon, though primarily ceremonial, in this setting was fully functional and loaded, as all guard weapons were, but firing into a crowd was unthinkable, the collateral damage potentially catastrophic. His mind raced through alternatives, each option evaluated and discarded in milliseconds. The training had covered this scenario 100 times, but reality always carried complications that simulations couldn't predict. The masked man was 20 feet away now, his focus entirely on Harrington. Whatever had driven him to this moment, political extremism, personal grievance, or simple madness, it had narrowed his world to this single target. His right hand moved toward his jacket, the motion quick but not quite quick enough to escape the notice of a soldier trained to spot such movements from hundreds of yards away in hostile territory. Guard Colonel Ashford's hand found his grandson's shoulder, ready to push the boy to safety at the first sign of violence. His own combat instincts, dulled by years of desk duty but never completely forgotten, urged him to act. But he was 62 years old, unarmed, and responsible for a child. His role in whatever was about to unfold would be limited to protecting Thomas and staying out of Harrington's way. The crowd's mood remained festive, their attention focused on the spectacle of the motionless guard rather than the approaching threat. A group of Italian tourists argued about the best angle for a photograph, their voices rising in animated discussion. An elderly American woman complained to her husband about the heat, fanning herself with a palace brochure. Children darted between their parents' legs, their laughter echoing off the palace walls. Harrington's breathing technique, learned in meditation sessions designed to maintain focus under extreme stress, kept his heart rate steady. His vision had sharpened to that hyper-aware state that combat veterans recognize, time seeming to slow, details becoming impossibly clear, the world narrowing to the immediate tactical situation. He could see the individual threads in the attacker's mask, smell the nervous sweat of Colonel Ashford 10 feet away, hear Thomas's excited whisper about the real soldier. The masked figure's hand emerged from his jacket, gripping a combat knife, its blade catching the sunlight in a brief, brilliant flash. It was military issue, Harrington noted automatically, probably British, possibly stolen or purchased on the black market. The serrated edge and tactical grip marked it as a weapon designed for killing, not intimidation. This was no amateur with a kitchen knife. Someone had armed this man with a professional tool of violence. The crowd's first scream came from a young woman who spotted the blade. Her cry cut through the cheerful babble like a siren, instantly transforming the festive atmosphere into panic. People began pushing away from the threat, parents grabbing children, elderly visitors stumbling in their haste to escape. The perfectly ordered queue dissolved into chaos as human nature asserted itself over British propriety. What happened next unfolded in the space between heartbeats. The masked attacker, perhaps startled by the crowd's reaction, or simply committed to his course of action, raised the knife above his head and lunged forward. His form was adequate but not professional, too much telegraphing, too much emotional commitment to the attack. A trained fighter would have been more economical, more deadly. Harrington's response was pure instinct, refined by countless hours of close-quarters combat training. His left hand swept up to intercept the descending blade, while his right maintained its grip on his rifle. The motion was so smooth, so precisely executed, that observers later swore it looked choreographed. His leather glove met the knife's handle with a sound like a gunshot, stopping the attack completely. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the tableau held. The masked attacker frozen in mid-stroke, his weapon trapped in Harrington's iron grip. The crowd pressed back in a semicircle of terrified faces. The guard's expression remained unchanged, as if catching airborne knives was simply another aspect of his ceremonial duties. His voice, when he spoke, carried the calm authority of a man who had disarmed desperate enemies in caves and compounds, thousands of miles from home. Poor form, Harrington observed, his tone as conversational as if he were commenting on the weather. Grip was all wrong. You telegraphed the attack too early, and you've committed your entire body weight to a single strike. Against a trained opponent, that's suicide. The words seemed to break the spell that had frozen the scene. Colonel Ashford moved with surprising speed for his age, tackling the attacker from behind and driving him to the ground. His grandson Thomas, rather than running, stood transfixed by the sight of his grandfather and the guard working together like partners in some deadly dance. The knife fell from nerveless fingers as the masked man found himself pinned beneath the combined weight of military experience and righteous anger. Harrington's subtle signal barely a tilt of his chin brought palace security running from their concealed positions. They had been watching the entire encounter, ready to intervene if necessary, but trained to allow the guards to handle immediate threats whenever possible. The response was professional and swift, the attacker secured and searched within seconds of hitting the ground. When they pulled off the mask, the face revealed was younger than anyone had expected, barely 19, hollow-cheeked and pale, with the desperate eyes of someone who had found purpose in violence because he couldn't find it anywhere else. His name, they would later learn, was Marcus Webb, a university dropout from Manchester who had spent the last year consuming radical content online, gradually convincing himself that dramatic action was the only way to make his voice heard. "You're just symbols of oppression," he screamed as the security officers lifted him to his feet. His voice cracked with the emotion of youth combined with the desperation of the truly lost. "The monarchy is a relic, a reminder of imperialism and class warfare. Someone has to take a stand." Harrington studied the young man's face with the same clinical detachment he had once applied to enemy fighters in Afghanistan. But instead of contempt or anger, what he felt was something approaching pity. This wasn't a hardened terrorist or a professional assassin. This was a child who had been failed by a system that should have given him direction, purpose, hope for the future. Symbols don't bleed in Helmand Province so that you can exercise your right to protest in Hyde Park, Harrington replied quietly. His words carried the weight of personal experience, of friends who hadn't come home, of nights spent in forward operating bases, wondering if the next patrol would be his last. They don't stand guard in the cold and rain so that university students can debate the merits of republicanism without fear of imprisonment. The crowd, which had been pressing forward to get a better look at the drama, fell silent at the guard's words. Many of them were tourists from countries where such exchanges between citizen and state would result in imprisonment or worse. The casual way Harrington had disarmed a knife-wielding attacker and then engaged in philosophical debate seemed to embody everything they had heard about British understatement and military professionalism. Colonel Ashford, still breathing hard from the exertion of tackling a man 40 years his junior, kept a protective arm around Thomas while the security team completed their work. The boy's eyes were wide with excitement rather than fear, his 7-year-old mind processing the event as an adventure rather than a genuine threat to life and limb. Later, in the sterile interview room at the local police station, Marcus Webb's story emerged in fits and starts. He had been a promising student once, studying philosophy at the University of Manchester, full of ideas about justice and equality, and the possibility of changing the world through intellectual discourse. But academic life had proven disappointing. The gap between theoretical idealism and practical reality too wide for his young mind to bridge. The internet had provided what the university could not, a sense of community, of shared purpose, of righteous anger directed at specific targets. He had found forums where his frustration was validated, where his sense of powerlessness was transformed into calls for action. The progression from discussion to planning to action had taken less than 6 months, each step seeming logical and necessary to a mind that had lost touch with perspective. The knife, investigators discovered, had indeed been military issue a British Army combat blade that had been stolen from a display case at a military museum in the Midlands. Webb had driven to London that morning, spending his last £50 on petrol and a train ticket, convinced that his sacrifice would inspire others to similar acts of defiance. He had expected to die in the attempt, had written what he thought was his manifesto on social media platforms that had long since banned such content. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, a 20-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police, had seen this pattern before. Young men, usually intelligent but directionless, finding purpose in extremist ideologies that offered simple answers to complex questions. The internet had made recruitment easier, allowing radical voices to reach into bedrooms and student halls, transforming frustration into violence with algorithmic precision. "He's not a terrorist in the traditional sense," Morrison explained to her colleagues during the briefing. "He's a lost kid who found the wrong answers to legitimate questions about social justice and political representation." The knife attack was meant to be symbolic rather than tactical. He wanted to make a statement, not necessarily to kill anyone. This distinction mattered in terms of prosecution and sentencing, but it also highlighted a broader problem that law enforcement was struggling to address: How do you combat extremism that grows from genuine social concerns? How do you distinguish between legitimate protest and dangerous radicalization? How do you reach young people before they reach the point where violence seems like the only option? The knife itself told its own story. Manufactured in Sheffield in 2003, it had been issued to Lance Corporal David Mitchell of the Parachute Regiment before his deployment to Iraq. Mitchell had carried it through 3 tours of duty, using it for everything from opening rations to cutting through debris while searching for improvised explosive devices. It had never drawn human blood, despite being present at some of the most violent encounters of the early occupation period. Mitchell had been killed by a roadside bomb outside Basra in 2006, and his personal effects had been returned to his family. In Wales, his father, a former steelworker named Robert Mitchell, had donated the knife, along with other military memorabilia, to a small museum dedicated to preserving the memory of local soldiers who had served in Iraq and Afghanistan. The museum, chronically underfunded and relying on volunteer staff, had inadequate security systems that made theft relatively easy for someone with basic planning skills. Webb had broken in during the early hours of a Tuesday morning, triggering no alarms and encountering no resistance. He had specifically sought out a military knife, believing that the symbolism of using a soldier's weapon against a soldier would amplify his message. The irony that Lance Corporal Mitchell had died defending the very freedoms that allowed Webb to plan his attack was lost on the young extremist, his worldview too narrow to accommodate such complexities. Robert Mitchell, when contacted by police about the theft, expressed more sadness than anger. David would have been heartbroken, he said, his Welsh accent thick with emotion. He believed in service, in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. To have his knife used to attack someone like that guard, it would have destroyed him all over again. The old man's words would later have a profound impact on Webb during his trial. Confronted with the human cost of his symbolic gesture, forced to understand that his actions had dishonored the memory of a soldier who had died in service to his country, Webb began to grasp the full weight of what he had attempted to do. Sergeant James Harrington's ability to disarm the attacker so smoothly hadn't developed overnight. It was the product of years of training that had begun with basic military instruction and been refined through bitter experience in some of the world's most dangerous places. His story began in a council estate in Birmingham, where opportunities for young men were limited and military service often represented the best path to a stable career. He had enlisted at 18, drawn more by necessity than patriotism, looking for structure and purpose that civilian life hadn't provided. Basic training at Catterick had been brutal but transformative, breaking down the cocky teenager he had been and rebuilding him as a disciplined soldier capable of functioning under extreme stress. His instructors had recognized something special in his combination of physical ability and mental toughness, recommending him for selection to the Parachute Regiment. Parachute training had tested him in ways he hadn't thought possible, pushing his body and mind to their limits while teaching him that success often depended on the willingness to continue when continuation seemed impossible. The red beret he earned represented not just technical competence but the kind of mental resilience that separated elite soldiers from ordinary troops. It was this training that had prepared him for what came next. His first deployment to Afghanistan in 2012 had been a shock despite all the preparation. The theoretical enemy of training exercises became real people with real weapons and real determination to kill him and his comrades. The mountains around Helmand province were beautiful and deadly, hiding Taliban fighters who knew the terrain better than any map could convey, and who were willing to die for their cause. The incident that had given Harrington his reflexes had occurred during a routine patrol in a village outside Lashkargah. Intelligence had suggested that Taliban fighters were using the village as a staging area for attacks on coalition forces, but the reality on the ground was more complex. Most of the villagers were simply trying to survive, caught between government forces they didn't trust and insurgents they feared. It had been a teenager then too, not much older than Marcus Webb, who had emerged from a doorway with a knife raised above his head. The attack had come without warning during what should have been a routine search of suspected insurgent safe houses. One moment Harrington had been questioning an elderly man about suspicious activity in the area. The next he was facing a blade aimed at his throat. The training had taken over before conscious thought could interfere. His left hand had swept up to intercept the weapon while his right had drawn his sidearm. the entire sequence unfolding in less than 2 seconds. But unlike the encounter at Buckingham Palace, this one had ended in bloodshed. The young Taliban fighter, high on opium and religious fervor, had continued to struggle even after being disarmed, forcing Harrington to make a choice that would haunt him for years afterward. The boy, for that's what he had been, barely 16 despite his fierce determination, had died in a dusty Afghan village thousands of miles from home, his blood pooling in the same dirt where children had played just hours before. Harrington had performed first aid, had tried to save the life of someone who had just tried to kill him, but the wounds were too severe and medical evacuation too distant. The teenager had died cursing him in Pashto, his eyes holding the same desperate conviction that Harrington would later recognize in Marcus Webb's face. That incident had changed him in ways that military debriefings and psychological evaluations couldn't fully address. The technical skills remained, if anything. They had been sharpened by the reality of life or death combat, but the easy confidence of youth had been replaced by a deeper understanding of the weight that came with the power to take life. Every training session afterward carried the memory of that dusty village. Every tactical exercise was informed by the knowledge of what combat really meant. When his tour ended and he returned to England, Harrington had seriously considered leaving the military. The transition from combat deployment to ceremonial duties seemed almost surreal. The pomp and pageantry of palace guard duty, a stark contrast to the harsh realities of counterinsurgency warfare. But his commanding officers had recognized his potential for leadership and recommended him for specialized training that would prepare him for the unique challenges of high-profile security assignments. The months following Marcus Webb's arrest revealed a young man struggling to understand the full implications of his actions. The terrorist charges were eventually reduced to assault and attempted grievous bodily harm, reflecting both the symbolic nature of his attack and the intervention of several character witnesses who testified to his previous good character and academic promise. His defense attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Elizabeth Chambers, argued that he was more victim than perpetrator, radicalized by online content that preyed on legitimate social concerns. But it was a letter from Sergeant Harrington that began Webb's real transformation. Written during off-duty hours in the guardroom at Wellington Barracks, it was a careful, thoughtful response to the young man's confused attempts to justify his actions. Harrington didn't lecture or condemn. Instead, he shared his own struggles with purpose and meaning, his own journey from working-class Birmingham to the gates of Buckingham Palace. "I understand the anger," Harrington wrote. "I understand the feeling that the system is rigged, that ordinary people don't have a voice, that dramatic action is the only way to force change. I felt the same way when I was your age. But I learned something in Afghanistan that I wish I could have learned earlier. Real change comes from building things, not tearing them down. It comes from service, not destruction." The correspondence between guard and former attacker continued throughout Webb's 18-month sentence. Harrington visited him twice, their conversations ranging from philosophy to practical concerns about post-release employment. The young man who had once seen the monarchy as a symbol of oppression gradually came to understand it as something more complex, an institution that could represent both tradition and progress, both continuity and change. Webb's transformation wasn't immediate or complete. There were setbacks, moments of doubt and anger that threatened to pull him back toward extremism. But the patient correspondence with Harrington, combined with educational programs in prison and therapy sessions that addressed the underlying issues that had made him vulnerable to radicalization, gradually gave him new perspectives on old problems. 6 months after his release, Webb enlisted in the British Army. The decision surprised everyone, including himself, but it represented a fundamental shift in how he understood service and sacrifice. The same idealism that had once driven him toward violence now motivated him toward constructive action. His recruitment officer, aware of his background, had initially been skeptical, but Harrington's personal recommendation had carried considerable weight. The final scene of this story unfolded on a crisp autumn morning, nearly 2 years after the knife attack. Sergeant Harrington was once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace, his scarlet tunic as immaculate as ever, his bearing as perfect as military training could make it. The tourists had returned in full force, their cameras clicking, their children pointing in wonder at the motionless figure who embodied centuries of military tradition. Colonel Ashford approached through the crowd, but this time he was alone. Thomas, now 9 years old, was at school. But he had insisted on drawing a picture for his soldier, a childish but recognizable portrait of Harrington catching the knife, like some kind of superhero. The drawing, carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper, was Ashford's excuse for the visit, though both men knew the real reason was simply to check on each other. "He asks about you constantly," Ashford reported, referring to his grandson. "Wants to know everything about being a soldier, about serving the Queen, about protecting people. I think you may have inspired a future officer, Sergeant." Harrington's expression didn't change. He was on duty. After all, but there was warmth in his eyes as he accepted the drawing. "Good lad. Make sure he understands that the real heroism isn't in the dramatic moments, Colonel. It's in the daily choice to serve something larger than yourself." Neither man mentioned Marcus Webb directly, but both were aware that the young former extremist was currently undergoing basic training at Catterick, the same facility where Harrington had been transformed from civilian to soldier years earlier. His instructors reported that he was an exceptional recruit, disciplined, dedicated, and possessed of a moral seriousness that set him apart from his peers. The knife from the attack had been preserved as evidence, and then donated to the Imperial War Museum, where it joined thousands of other artifacts that told the story of British military service. A small placard noted its history: combat knife, British Army issue, carried by Lance Corporal David Mitchell in Iraq 2004-2006, stolen 2023, recovered following failed attack on Royal Guard. The full story was too complex for a museum label, but visitors who read carefully could piece together the connections between service and sacrifice, between individual choices and historical consequences. As the afternoon wore on and the crowds began to thin, Harrington remained at his post, a living symbol of the values that Marcus Webb had once sought to destroy and now hoped to defend. The cycle was complete. In its Wangar transformed into service, destruction redirected toward protection, extremism replaced by duty. It wasn't a perfect redemption story, but it was a human one, full of the contradictions and complications that made real life more complex than any ideology could encompass. The sun began to set behind the palace walls, casting long shadows across the courtyard, where tourist and terrorists, guard and colonel, past and future, continued their ancient dance of conflict and resolution, service and sacrifice, tradition and change. In the end, that's what the uniform represented: not just military might or royal prerogative, but the continuing human struggle to create something better than what came before. One choice, one moment, one act of courage at a time.